time to begin our second episode for the day.
Promoters of the family, and then when the second and third generation come in, so they would sell to other companies that would produce textiles.
What is your take on how should family constitutions evolve?
Are core to any family office, and how should the family overall do things?
It's time to begin our second episode for the day that talks about next generation. So, Mr. Manish, how different is this generation really? I'm keen to know your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so this generation, and I would say actually when we deal with a lot of family offices, we actually see three generations. But I'll kind of talk about the difference between the original promoters of the family and then the second and third generation. The difference really is in the way they view technology, the way they view investments. They're more open to looking at newer technologies. They're open to looking at newer investment options. So their view is very different than the traditional, let's, get our hands dirty. Let's get into the operating business. And let's, if we need to build more plants, let's build more plants. Let's go after the market share. Let's go after new markets. So that's kind of what separates, I'd say the first generation from generation 2 and 3. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but I think, the first generation, they had no other option. When you have no other option, you do what you need to do in that moment. So you see a lot of businesses, people have, emigrated from Rajasthan and they've gone into other parts of India because there's not much you can do in the desert. So you have to kind of get out there, and that's what they've done. And they've built these businesses from scratch, and they've had the luxury of not really competing against other businesses because they were kind of given, maybe a license to get into a certain sector, and they've done that. And they've grown it. And now when the second and third generation come in, those generations now can decide, do they want to continue with that or do they want to do other things? And so that's really, I think the biggest difference is they've got more options, they've got more avenues, and more importantly, they've got more exposure. And that's a combination of, being probably going to school internationally, or just because of the internet, they can kind of see what's out there. And that's the key difference between, I'd say, the first generation and what I would call generation 2 and 3.
So according to you, in your opinion, what are your views on traditional assets? What is your take on that?
So I don't have an opinion, I would say, but what I do see is there is definitely a clear distinction between traditional assets and what I would also say the new economy. And that's where I can see where the second generation and the third generation are more interested in exploring the newer types of investment options. And it's again, example, recently I had interacted with a family that's textile, and they've been a direct producer of textile products, and they've done a lot of B2B. So they would sell to, other companies that would produce textiles. The younger generation is also interested in textiles, but they're more interested in going direct to consumer. So that's more of what I'd say new economy. Let's sell directly to the consumer, even though, it's probably more effort on their part, but I think they're more interested because that is where a lot of the, newer, entrepreneurs are talking about direct to consumer. And because of marketing and getting access, this family, of course, they've got this huge, 30, 40, 50 years of textile knowledge. And the kids are saying, instead of us running the traditional business, we also don't want to run the family office. Why don't we get into direct to consumer and sell to, our peer groups? And that's what's happening. So that is, like I say, a difference between traditional assets, old economy versus the new economy. And I don't mean to say old is bad, but it definitely is what they have always seen. Like I said, the first generation, they could never envision selling on the internet. So all they did was, hey, let's bulk, do textiles and sell to these other larger companies. And that's the difference.
So could you explain us the role of education and exposure before wealth transfer? What is your take on that?
So I kind of elaborated it previously, but the truth is education is something that, when people go out of the country, and I'm not saying that's the only option. There are, definitely great universities and colleges here in India, but I think when they travel internationally and they kind of sit with other peers that are from other countries, they kind of see how those things are structured, whether it's the operational business or whether it's a family office. And that exposure allows them to understand, when they come back to India, do they want to, like I said, get back into the operating business? Do they want to maybe start the family office, or do they want to, set up a business that's adjacent to the main business. So in fact, I have seen someone talk about, their business is actually pharma, and some of the kids want to actually get into healthcare. So it's kind of adjacent to the pharma industry, but it's not directly into the API, the formulation, or the generics. So I see a lot of that. So I think that exposure is a big way of them dealing with, what do they want to do when they come back to the country? And whether it's education, whether it's just being outside the country, it makes a big difference for them because they can kind of see best practices from other people.
Okay. And lastly, what is your take on how should family constitutions evolve?
So I think family constitution is, people always say, oh, that's like the mission statement of a company or a startup. But I really feel the family constitution and another thing that they call the investor policy statement are, core to any family office. And that really is kind of the charter of how the family office should function and how should the family overall do things. It's sort of like a roadmap, so many times what I see, kids in the family office, they see a friend doing something or they want to invest in that startup. They still have to run it by the investment committee. And that's because they've got a very formal structure. And I think it's a good thing because otherwise they'll just invest in everything for their family.
Quite impressive. You really shared with us some amazing experiences. All right, so this ends our episode 2.